Thanks very much, Ed. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it. Um, I'm going to talk about desert music, but the desert is a very large place, as you can imagine. And talking about all desert music is probably impossible in the hour that I've been given. So I'm going to focus on the style of desert music which I know best, which is Tuareg guitar music. You could do another hour on Songboy music from the Niger River Delta, or on Mauritanian music, or music from southern Morocco. Um, Maybe one day we'll do a 10-part Netflix series, but for the moment, we've got 1 hour and I'm going to concentrate on Tuareg music, which is, as I say, the bit I know best. So I've put together this little slideshow. Hopefully it will give you a bit of a more vivid impression of what's going on in the desert. And to start off with, who are the Tuareg and where did they live? The Tuareg are originally a nomadic people. They're a Berber people. That means that their language isn't Arabic. It's what's called Tamazight or Tamashek. Um, in fact, they call themselves the Kel Tamashek, which means the people who speak Tamashek. Tuareg, like Eskimo, is a name that was given to them. God knows when. There's a lot of debate about that, but isn't the way that they refer to themselves, although they do. So people get very uppity about it, but often you do hear Tuareg people saying the Tuareg. But if they talk to amongst themselves, they say the Kel Tamashek. And they live within this orange blob you see on the map. So in parts of Libya, Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And they're split up into confederations of tribes, and the confederations are split up into tribes or large groups, or whatever you want to call it, and the groups are split up into clans, and the clans are split up into families, and the families are split up into smaller units. And they're very as a result of this, they were until very recently a very divided people. In fact, to people who had very little sense of themselves as a nation, as a people, as the Tuareg or the Kel Tamashek or anything. And it's really music, and especially the music of Tinariwen and of other foundational bands, that helped to give them that sense of a people who had something in common and who could sort of relate to one another as one entity. So music played a very, very important part in that. And the part of the desert that is most important to our story is really northern Mali, and especially this town called Kidal, which is right up in the far northeastern corner of Mali. It's kind of like the flashpoint of all Tuareg conflict, but also of all the best Tuareg music. And it continues in that role to this day. And has been really in the headlines a lot in the last 10 years when the northern Mali has descended into a war zone, and Kidal has been often at the center of the conflict. What does the countryside look like? Sorry, I've flipped it. Sorry. This is a picture I took when I visited Kidal in about 2007, I would say. And as you can see, it's a place that's, well, very arid. It also has very, very lush kind of river valleys that turn into an incredible green when the rainy season comes. Rainy season is June, July, or August. And it can really look like a field in England if you go there at that time of year. But very few outsiders do, because it's hot and sticky, and there are lots of scorpions, and it's not a particularly hospitable time of year. But the rest of the year, it looks something like this, with these incredible rock formations. And this is I was with Tinariwen. In fact, the guy you can see here in the kind of blue bubul, as we call them, the long robe, is Ibrahim, the founder and main guy of Tinariwen. And it also looks like this, just absolutely flat endless, little dotted with little acacia trees and tapsit trees and various hardy forms of tree that can survive. Or it can look like this as well. This is just a picture of a convoy going up. This is the main road, like the M1, if you like, that goes through the region north from the river, from Niger River up into Algeria. And you can see how incredibly impressive and arid it looks. And originally, this whole region and most of the Sahara was just inhabited by nomads. And most Tuareg, I'd say over 60%, are still nomads. They still live the nomadic life. And they build tents like this out of goat skin, leather. And nomadism isn't a kind of romantic, kind of wandering existence. It's actually a very much a way to survive in quite an inhospitable climate. And what you do is you just go with your family and your animals, you go from one well to the other according to the seasons, usually within an orbit of about 200 miles, not much more than that. And the only reason historically that any Tuareg would travel more than 200 miles was because they were part of a caravan to go and buy salt or to trade ivory or some of the old gold even back in the day. That's the kind of thing to do. But otherwise, they live in tents like this. Here's another picture of and some of these encampments are actually very beautiful, nestled amongst the trees, very clean, as you can see with the fire. And this is one thing that is hard to convey, which is that the nomadic life is hard, but when they have what they want, which is water, basically when the wells are giving off the water they need, when the trees are healthy and the animals are healthy, it's actually quite an idyllic existence, strangely enough. Not for all of the year, but in the good parts of the year when there's enough to be getting on with. And here's another camp with the family sitting in the shade during the heat of the day. It shows you what life was like. And this is a picture that I took in a refugee camp in Burkina Faso, very near Ouagadougou. And the guy who's playing the traditional lute, which is called the Teherden, is a member of the band Tartite Ensemble, quite a famous international band. And they were living as nomads in effect, but in a refugee camp. So not doing the nomadic animal herding, but same thing of tents and just living that life in the refugee camp. And traditionally, it was a very, very hierarchical society, a bit like us 200 years ago in the UK. Lords. You had the lords or the warrior nobility who were called the Imusha. And here's a picture of some camels at the first festival in the desert with riders who are Imusha descendants. And then underneath them, you would have the vassals who are called the Imrad. You'd have the men of Islam, who are the holy men, who are called the Ineslemen, the men of Islam. You'd have the artisans, who are called the Inadan. And you'd have the slaves, who are called the Iklan. And needless to say, this whole hierarchy, this whole way of life has been completely mashed up in the last 50, 60 years. So much so that it's hardly recognizable. But vestiges of it, echoes of it, still play their part in Tuareg society and in Tuareg life. And one of the things where it really began to change was obviously in the colonial era, when the French co-opted a lot of the Imusha, a lot of the clan leaders, or the actual chief is called an Amenokal, that's the name for a chief. And the French basically ruled through their Amenokal. And you had huge areas where there'd maybe just be one or two French people, and the rest were just these native Gounier, the kind of native African or Malian soldiers, and who basically kept law and order in an area the size of the UK or France. because they ruled through these chiefs, the Amenokal. But because of that, the chiefs lost a lot of their power, a lot of their independence, and a lot of their status as well, and was kind of the whole sort of power structure was severely affected by colonialism. And then in 1960, September 1960, Mali became an independent nation, one of the first in the Sahara to become an independent nation. And the Tuareg of the Northeast had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. And when they were suddenly the Malian army, i.e. Southerners, from 1,000, 1,500 miles away, suddenly arrived in their trucks and their cars and said, we are now your rulers, you're now being ruled by us. They were actually more or less taken by surprise and very much resented the policies of the new government of Mali, which was very much a socialist Soviet-style policy, who wanted to collectivize all agriculture, wanted to force all children to have a kind of Western-style French education. And there were other things that the Tuareg didn't like at all, because they didn't think it fitted in with their way of life. And so they launched a rebellion in 1963. It was actually launched by this man here, Eladi Ag Allah, who only died a few years ago of a great age. But here you see him after his arrest in 1963 being led away by Malian soldiers. And it was just a little skirmish that broke out between him and some of these Goumier, but it ended up in horrific repression that lasted several months. There were stories of people being thrown down, bodies being thrown down wells in order to poison wells, of whole villages being forced to come out and watch the execution of suspected rebels. It really was a kind of scorched earth policy. And in that time, a little boy called Ibrahim Ag al-Habib was at home one morning when the soldiers came round and arrested his father. And his father was taken away to the barracks in Kidal and basically starved to death. And the soldiers then massacred the family herd. And not being an agricultural person, it's maybe a bit hard to understand how devastating that is. But to a Tuareg, the herd is everything. The herd, they know all their camels by name. They're like part of the family. And so for a herd of camels or cows or goats or whatever to be massacred is as bad as seeing your family massacred, really. And that Ibrahim Ag al-Habib was the founder member of Tinariwen. And he wrote a song called 1963, which is one of the most famous Tinariwen songs. It's called 63, which is 63 in French. And it talks about that terrible rebellion in which he lost his father. And I'm going to try and play a track, but I really have no idea whether this is going to work. Ed, can you tell me if you can hear this?
لا ننتمتى راسي دير جوان أنا قيوان.
So hopefully that song will give you, really conveys a sense of the pain that that particular incident caused Ibrahim, and that is mirrored by the pain that the whole rebellion inflicted on the Tuareg of northeastern Mali. It was a very, very severe blow. And it was led by, the rebellion was led by one of the Amenokal, one of the hereditary chiefs, this guy called Zaid Agataher. And he was captured and put in prison in Taodeni, which is the remotest settlement in the whole of the Sahara, and remained a prisoner until very, very recently. And he died in prison up there. And on the heels of this rebellion, the region of Kidal, that whole region of the northeast Mali, became was put under military control, under martial law. And very soon afterwards, the region was hit by the most devastating droughts. The drought of 1969 to 73, roughly the dates are rough, and the droughts of 84 to 86. The drought of 84 is the same drought that hit Ethiopia, that we heard a lot about with Live Aid and all of that. But just as it hit Ethiopia, it hit that part of the Sahara incredibly hard. Now, what happens when you have drought is that the animals die. And without animals, a nomad cannot be a nomad. It's like being a taxi driver without a taxi. Basically, your livelihood is gone. And so the nomads had to go into refugee camps or just travel into other parts of the desert, or just leave the desert altogether and go into other parts of the region, Algeria, Nigeria, all sorts of things. And again, this was a massive and very, very painful upheaval. There you see pictures of animals dying due to the effects of drought. And this was widespread. Something like 70% of the animals that existed before the droughts had died by the end of them. And it led to real misery and deprivation, famine. It led to a lot of anger as well, because a lot of aid money was embezzled and basically embezzled by corrupt politicians and put in their Swiss bank accounts and that kind of thing. And it led to a massive exodus of people, especially young men. And these young men would leave their homes in Kidal and Gao in Mali and go north or south. This is really showing the northern exodus into Tamanrasset in Algeria, to places like Janet, up to Algiers, and then further afield to Libya, to Tripoli, Benghazi, Sebha, Ghat. And this was the beginning of a cultural and social revolution, really, because these young men left on their own, and for the first time they encountered the modern life that we know. They experienced cities, they experienced cars, they experienced TV, they experienced modern fashion, they experienced modern mores, and they experienced modern music as well, music that they'd never heard, like the music of North Africa, the Rai music from Morocco, but also Western rock music, all kinds of bands that they would buy on cassette. And these young men really lived a sort of hand-to-mouth existence in various desert towns. And they were often arrested by police, denigrated by local people who used the French word chômeur, which means unemployed person. Basically a kind of on the dole layabout. Basically, it was an insult. And they took that insult and used it for their own, and they kind of turned it into a badge of pride and called themselves Ishumars, which comes from the French word chômeur. And it's the Ishumars, this whole generation of young Tuareg who left home to find work, to find a new life and to have an adventure. It's the Ishumars who invented the guitar music that we know, basically. So they are absolutely crucial in the story of Ibrahim. He left his home in southern Algeria. That's where he'd escaped to with his family when he was a little toddler in 1963. And he basically, his journey was the journey of so many others, because he went north, he got a job as a tailor, then he got a job as a carpenter, a bricklayer, a gardener. He went, the first town he arrived in was a place called Gardaia, which is in the northern Sahara. And he told me once that he got off, he got a lift from someone, and he got off the bus and he stood in front of a TV shop for hours looking at these TV sets, because he'd never seen anything like it before. And he was totally fascinated by them. And then he went to Libya and he bought himself jeans and watches, and with the little money he earned doing the various odd jobs he was doing. So that was the Ishumar life. And here, this is what an Ishumar scene might have looked at 30, 40 years ago. A couple of guys with guitars hanging around, a cassette, a sort of ghetto blaster, listening to music, recording their music, in a sort of beaten up old house in some desert village or town. And here's some more Ishumar young guys, very much the unwanted of the desert, the Generation X of the desert, if you like. And they started to play music, and none of them were traditional music. Before, in traditional society, music had been women. It was the affair of women, just as education, cultural education, writing, folklore, all these things. It's the women who instructed the next generation. The only kind of music that men played was either the shepherd's flute, because was only men who did the job of a shepherd, or kind of a sort of recited poetry. That was the only traditional music that men were allowed to play, unless they belonged to special castes of artisans who were, as well as being blacksmiths and leather makers, they were also musicians, like griots. If you've heard of the term griot in Malian culture, well, they were the griots of the Tuareg, but they didn't use that word. They just called themselves artisans. And so the music that the Ishumar had grown up with, that influenced what became Tuareg guitar music, was very multifaceted, but at its core was traditional music known as the tinde. And the tinde is the name of this drum that's made out of a mortar carved from wood, that you crush your millet, your seed, to make flour, and they stretch a goat skin over the top of it, and that is the drum, and only women play it. And it's very much alive as a culture, and still now. And if you go to the desert, which is very hard at the moment, I wouldn't recommend it, but one day, God willing, we will be able to go back to the desert, and there undoubtedly we'll see groups of women playing tinde, and it's one of the most beautiful sounds, because I'll play you a bit in a second, but it has this rhythm, which is basically the core rhythm of all Tuareg music. All modern Tuareg music is based on this tinde rhythm, on this tinde beat, and they play it, and I've seen it with my own eyes. Men riding camels come and dance. In other words, the camels walk precisely in step with the beat that they're playing in the drum, on the drum, and they parade round the group of women. And there's a lot of very, very secret, very, very clandestine flirtation going on between these young men on their camels and the women in their thing. And it's really the most impressive, one of the most impressive sights. This is another group of women playing Tinde, and you see the drum there it's got a goatskin stretch, and then they put a cloth over the goatskin, which they keep dousing with water to keep it moist. It's something to do with the sound, I'm not exactly sure. And the kind of music they sing is call and response. So there'll be a lead woman who sings one melody, and then all the women respond. And that is also the basic format of all Tuareg guitar music. There are very few Tinariwen songs that don't follow that format of call and response. And for me, it really reflects, it's emblematic of the way society is organized, where basically the individual is nothing without his or her entourage, his family, his friends. You know, that is basically the bedrock of what keeps society together. And that's very much reflected in all of the music. And let me see. There, I've got this old, but unfortunately, I don't think it will work. But there was a film that I found taken in the 1930s of a Tinde out in the desert somewhere. But it might be a little bit complicated to play that. Maybe you could find it on Google if you're interested. But what I will do is play a Tinde piece of Tinde music. Coming up now. So that's the Tinde, and they go on for hours like that, hours and hours. And often when I've been on tour with Tinariwen, if they're if they've just got a bit of a downtime and they're just listening to something, they're often listening to Tinde. It's like a sort of connection with home, you know. And so I'm just going to go through just some of the sort of what became, what are the elements that went into this mix that became Tuareg guitar music. The other thing is the Tuareg flute. Now that is an instrument that called the tarnit. It's an instrument. It's one of the few instruments that anyone who's a shepherd is allowed to play, and it's very, very beautiful. There are several Tinariwen songs that feature Ibrahim playing the flute. One of my favorite is one called Alha Assouf, which is on Amasaku, the second album. And I really urge you to go and check those out because it's an absolutely haunting and beautiful sound. A massive influence on the art of desert guitar music of Tinariwen and most other bands is traditional poetry. Any Tuareg from the desert will see Tinariwen as poets first and musicians second. It's like, you know, but they don't see any separation between the two. Poetry is delivered musically. Even when it's recited in quite a musical way traditionally by these poets. And it's a very, very old tradition. There's a guy, I'm just going to zip ahead. There's this strange character called Père de Foucault, or Père Foucault, who was a French army officer who became a priest. And his story is fascinating, but there's not enough time to tell it really. But he basically went to live in Tamanrasset in southern Algeria when there was almost nobody living there, apart from a few Haratin, as they're called, who are sort of freed slaves who were kind of tilling a few plots by the river. And he went to live on his own, and he became completely immersed in Tuareg culture. This is, you're talking between about 1899 and 1916. And he wrote the first dictionary of Tamashek to French. And he also collected a lot of poems at the time. And if you read those poems, there are so many echoes of what Tinariwen sing about, or what the more modern Tuareg bands sing about. The themes seem to persist over that period of decades, of centuries, or whatever. And often the theme of loss, of love, of nature, of the desert, of a beautiful camel, of a beautiful man, a beautiful warrior, a beautiful woman, the lushness of a certain part of the desert, the bravery of a certain warrior. These are the themes that were in the old poetry and that crop up again and again in the lyrics of Tinariwen and other bands. And I've just found this on the internet. It's basically a page from a CD of poems that was compiled by a Tuareg intellectual called Hawad. And on the left-hand side, you see that their traditional script, which is called Tifina. On the right, you see a French translation. And I translated the French very quickly this afternoon. And it gives a real flavor of the kind of lyric that you might hear today. Like last year, I was living in a territory impossible to map or define, a part of the desert that stretched borderless to infinity. No traveler could be seen, nor any news could be heard. In me, there was vigor and languor. On our feet again, we shake ourselves awake. I launch into a song and articulate it, raising and lowering my voice. And this is a poem that was written in the 1910s or 1920s. It could have been written today very easily. Interesting what he says about nor any news could be heard, because basically you only get news in traditional society if you met a traveler, if you met someone coming from another place. That was so the first thing you say is how, God bless you, how are you? And then what's the news? And now news comes through TV and satellite phones and mobile phones and all the rest of it. And one of the greatest poets of modern times is this man here, Mohammed Agit Al-Chapaneh, who died earlier this year. And he was early member of Tinariwen. He was a bit of a wild character, so it's very difficult to bring him on tour because he was just very difficult to manage in that way. But he was a brilliant person and a brilliant poet, and has contributed quite a few tracks to Tinariwen albums, and the lyrics are gorgeous. He was very, very, very lamented when he died. Another influence is a style of music that comes from Gao, and it's called takamba, and it's played on calabash, which is a gourd that's been cut in half and dried, and is hit with the fingers or with a cigarette lighter. And on these instruments called teherden. You saw one earlier in one of the earlier pictures. And it's the most beautiful, flowing kind of music. And it's also very unique because it's music that's played by Tuareg people and Songoi people. The Songoi are another ethnicity who live by the river. They're sedentary, unlike the Tuareg, who are nomads. They grow their crops and all that kind of thing. And they've often been in conflict, especially in recent years, very, very serious conflict. So Takamba is a kind of music of hope in a way, because it brings together these two communities that are often in conflict. But it also shows that all these ethnic groups that you'll read in headlines have been massacring each other or whatever, they actually have been living in symbiosis for centuries. And it's only the pressures of modernity often that create conflicts between them, or that revive conflicts that had been dormant for a long, long time. And I put a video here, but I don't think we can play it because I haven't quite mastered the technology. But I did want to play you a little bit of Takamba, because it's the most fantastic music. I'll see if I can. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Sorry to have to cut that short, but I see that time is fast running out on us. The people who played these were these sort of Tuareg griots, these artisans, and when the Ishumar were living in southern Algeria, they would often also arrive in town, having been forced out because there was just nothing left for them back home, and they would charge huge fees to come and play at parties or gatherings. And one of the reasons that young guys like Ibrahim and like other founder members of Tinariwen started playing for themselves is that they couldn't afford to pay these guys to entertain them at parties and stuff like that. But they still had a massive influence. Another big influence on the music was Ali Farka Touré. Even though he's a Songoi, he's not a Tuareg, because what Ali Farka did that was so revolutionary is that he managed to kind of reinvent the music of Northern Mali, in his case, Songoi music or some music, because he was kind of, he knew songs from many, many different ethnicities. He would sing those songs and he would sing them on the Western guitar. And that was completely revolutionary at the time. And because he played, he frequently would perform live on national radio, this new sound sort of spread throughout the whole country. And people suddenly realized, well, wow, we can play our old music on new instruments. That was a complete revelation to everyone. And they also loved the kind of radical music of Morocco, what's called Shabi music of the 1970s, that was kind of political, revolutionary, young, very, very risky, kind of rebellious, if you like. And one band that Ibrahim has told me he absolutely loved at the time is Nasoghiwan, who were a Moroccan band, and there were many more like them. And they loved Rai music as well, so some more good time music. And this is an amazing old cover I found of Sheikha Rumiti, who's one of the kind of godmothers of Rai music, a cover from the 1960s. And they love Western music, but people exaggerate the amount because they knew very little about Western music. They would buy what happened most of the time is that someone would buy a cassette and then record it onto another cassette and then onto another cassette and then onto another cassette. So by the time it arrived with our young Ishumar friends, there was no information on it at all, but they still listened to it and they loved it. So they often didn't know what they were listening to. But a band that they love, that I tell you, if this band played a concert in the Sahara, there would easily be 100,000 people there. It's Dire Straits. They absolutely adore Dire Straits, but they talk about Jimi Hendrix but also slightly surprising bands like Boney M and Kenny Rogers were also very popular at the time. So there you go. And they started playing their own music, but they didn't have any instruments. So they would build their own guitars out of plastic water canisters or petrol canisters, bits of wood and bicycle brake wire. And they called these guitars bidon. And that's how almost every kid until recently, now you can get a guitar quite easily. But until recently, every kid who wanted to play guitar, this would be their school, playing on one of these guitars. And you can see the cover of Tinariwen's fourth album, Imidiwan. The sound engineer, Jean-Paul, took this wonderful picture of a bunch of kids in the village called Tesselit, where it was being recorded, with one of these old guitars. It doesn't actually have any strings, but you get the idea. And that's how. But then they graduated to proper guitars. Here's a beautiful picture of Ibrahim, the founder of Tinariwen, with his guitars and his Vox amp on the back of a camel, taken at the time of recording Imidiwan. The story of how Ibrahim got his folk guitar is really fascinating. In 1979, he was living in Tamanrasset with some Ishumar friends. Tamanrasset is this town in southern Algeria that has now basically become the capital of the unofficial capital of the Tuareg nation that doesn't exist, just like the Kurdish nation doesn't exist. But it's the biggest town in the desert, really. It's 200 to 250,000 inhabitants now. But in those days, it was basically 15, 20,000 people maximum. It was still quite a small place. And he was hanging out there, and he was sitting on a hump of dirt by the water tower, and he saw a man walk by with a proper guitar. And the only time he'd ever seen a proper guitar in his life before was in a Western, in a film that he'd seen as a child, and he dreamed about it ever since. And he came back day after day, and he saw this man going slightly out of town and playing guitar to himself. And then one day he plucked up the courage. He was 19 at the time, to talk to this guy and say, and he said, I love your guitar, or something like that. And the man said, can you make tea? And tea making is central. Every Tuareg knows how to make tea. And he said, yeah. And he said, well, come home and make some tea, and I'll let you play it. So he went back home, made some tea, and he touched a proper guitar for the first time in his life. He was 19 years old, and in the end, he persuaded the man to sell it to him, and that was the first guitar that any young Tuareg had ever played in 1979. And so they started playing together, these bunch of friends. They didn't really even think of themselves as a band, but they started playing at parties and gatherings, or just going out into the desert with a little bit of food and a bag of tea and a little kettle to brew the tea up. And they didn't like being in town, because in town they would be harassed by the police. They were considered to be delinquents, really. But out in the desert, they were free, they could be who they were. And so they started calling themselves Kel Tinariwen, which means the people of the deserts. Tinariwen is a word that means, is the plural of the word tenere, which means desert, open desert, empty desert. And so they were the boys from the desert, Kel Tinariwen. And that's how their name came into being. And one of the, they invented their own language for the guitar. They invented their own tunings. They didn't know how, they had no one to teach them. So they would just fiddle around with the strings until it sounded just about right. And they didn't transpose the old songs on there, started writing new songs. And this guy, Giara, who was one of the founder members, he became the first Tuareg rhythm guitar player. And he is actually the god of Tuareg rhythm guitar, because most Tuareg guitar playing is kind of lead guitar. But if you ever, he's now in a band called Terrakaft, who are kind of offshoot of Tinariwen. But if you ever have a chance to see him play live, it's wonderful. He is the most. He's like the sort of rhythm guitarist in the JBs and the James Brown band. He's just absolutely minimal, but absolutely dead on. It's the most beautiful thing to watch. And I just need to talk. We're running out of time, aren't we? But what was the music about when they started singing? Well, a lot of it was about the predicament that Ibrahim and his friends and the Ishumar, these hundreds, the tens of thousands of young Tuareg scattered all around the desert were in, where they were far from home, they missed home, they felt a deep longing and sickness for home, for their family, for their women folk, who generally, it was a male exodus. The women would leave, but they would go into refugee camps or stay with family or whatever. So they were missing their sisters, their mothers, their aunts, their girlfriends. And their music is impregnated with a feeling, an emotion, a very complex emotion, which they called Assouf, which is basically the most important word when it comes to Tuareg music. I've written a bit here because my memory is pretty bad, so I just wanted to get this right. So Assouf is one of the most evocative words in the Tamashek language. It means loneliness, heartache, longing, homesickness, and loss. But it also means the darkness beyond the campfire, the coldness that remains when laughter and human warmth have departed. So because of the way nomadic life, the reality of nomadic life, you'll set up a camp, you'll stay there a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. And while you're there, it's warm, there's a fire, there's the sound of family, the sound of animals and everything. And then all that warmth disappears, it goes. And so Assouf is what remains afterwards. It's the longing, it's the nostalgia for what was once there. And so Assouf is the duende of flamenco, the saudade of fado, the hireth of Welsh poetry. It's the real blues of the desert, the blues of the heart, a shadow, a necessity, a curse, and an inspiration. The Ishumar left home to confront both forms of Assouf, the Assouf that lingers in the heart and the Assouf that lurks in the darkness of the unknown. Because what the Ishumar did is they went and met modernity head on. And by doing that, they changed Tuareg society forever. And actually willfully broke down some of that hierarchy that we were talking about, some of that clanism, the tribalism. They very much saw themselves as a kind of progressive force. And they found all that in the darkness beyond the culture that they knew. And so many Tinariwen songs or songs by so many Tuareg bands are about Assouf in its various forms. And Père de Foucault, what's so interesting is that Père de Foucault, the priest that we were talking about, who was in the desert 100 years ago, he wrote about Assouf. He was already recording poems that were talking about Assouf 120 years ago. And he translated lines like, this is in old poems, like, it's the Assouf of the violin. That's the traditional one-string violin. It's the longing, Assouf, the longing for the violin that's killing you. I spent the night behind a sadness, stroke, Assouf, that's the word, of the devil caused by your absence. And the spirits of the desert, because the Tuareg, even though they're Muslims, are very animist in their imagination. And they believe that the desert is peopled by spirits, that stones is peopled by spirits and everything. And they call these spirits the Assouf, the people of Assouf, the people of the dark place. It's very important. It's very important to understand Assouf. Here's a song called Assouf Ag Assouf. It's quite a famous Tinariwen song, and it illustrates it pretty well. Assouf, song of Assouf, whose shadow appears when the sun sets. Assouf, I know that we are tied, bound together in friendship. Assouf, I make him my friend. We'll never be separated, awake or asleep. And I've got so much more to talk about, but Ed, should we be sort of winding up and taking questions?
I think yeah, carry on for a little bit if you need to. That's
okay.
If there's
I'll try and whiz through my next because it's very important to understand the history. So so Tinariwen really if you scroll back to the early 80s, a very few people playing guitar. It's basically the group of people around Tinariwen, and there was also a parallel group in Niger, which is the country neighboring Mali. They called themselves Takris Nakal, and they basically started at the same time. And these were the founders of Tuareg guitar music. And all the young Ishumar basically got an invitation put out on Libyan radio by Gaddafi to come and train in military camps in Libya in the early 80s. Gaddafi had one idea in his head, and he basically spieled the whole line about how he was going to train them up to take back their homeland. And in fact, he had no intention of doing that. He really wanted to create a kind of mercenary army to fight his wars against Chad and against other neighboring countries. But anyway, they answered the call, and they basically spent time in two chunks, one in the early 80s and one between 1985 and 1989. All the founding members of Tinariwen went into and lived in military camps and became part of a special regiment that he called Gaddafi called the Islamic Regiment of the Sahara. And they were in the second stint, 85 to 90, they were sponsored by no one else except for the other fellow fighters, soldiers, to be the kind of resident band in that camp. And money was gathered to buy instruments and amplifiers and stuff like that. And they became this band, and it became almost like a sort of propaganda machine for the Tuareg movement. Except that that's never how they saw themselves. Ibrahim certainly sees his songs as much more personal, much more poetry than propaganda. But their songs got copied on tape and ghetto blasters, and those tapes got copied, and they got copied again and again and again and again. And that's how their music spread throughout the Sahara, in this vast region where there's no TV, there was no radio in the Tamashek language. There were no newspapers. So they became the media, they became the mouthpiece. Their songs became the stories that everyone heard. And that's what made them famous in their own land, And then in 1990, a lot of them went AWOL from Gaddafi's camps, just left without leave, went back to Mali and fought a rebellion that lasted 6 months against the Malians. And it changed everything, basically. It's too complex to go into, but it was led by this guy, Yad Gali. This is an amazing old photo from 1990. And he was a big friend of Tinariwen. He even wrote songs for them. He was the kind of leader of the whole movement, a very talented guy in many ways. And this is a picture of the Mouvement National de l'Azawad, the MNA. Azawad is the name they give to the kind of homeland, their dreamed of homeland that hasn't come into being yet, but they're always hoping will do one day. And from 1919, you see Ibrahim from Tinariwen in his combat fatigues here with the other rebel soldiers. And this is another picture with Abdallah, who's one of the main singers of Tinariwen today, in his combats as well. And another very important member of Tinariwen at the time was Kidal, who was a very renowned warrior. You might have read stories about members of Tinariwen going in with a Stratocaster on one shoulder and a Kalashnikov on the other shoulder. Well, that's kind of romanticized because it hardly ever happened, but apparently Kidal did actually go into battle in that kind of mode, you know, because he had to, because there's no other way of carrying his guitar or his Kalashnikov. So it was a practical thing, but it's become a sort of stuff of legend since then. And this is a cassette cover of a very early Tinariwen cassette from 1982. You can see them all very young with their afros. There's Jara, that's Abdallah, that's Hassan, who's the kind of vibe master, the dancer. Ibrahim's not with them. I don't even know who that guy is.